Well, hello. Welcome to the gathering. For those of you who don't know, my name is Adam, and I guess, do I need to do my introduction?
Yes.
My name is Adam. I was in the Army, and I am the youth pastor. So it seems like just last year I was up here, maybe a day after the day, talking with you guys. It was the end of the year. It was the New Year's sermon, and I honestly, for a good long while, I thought about just grabbing the sermon I preached last year, dusting the digital dust off of it, and preaching it again. And I wondered if anyone would even notice. To be honest, I had to look at it to remember what it was about. So don't feel bad if you don't, because I didn't either. But we talked last year. It was about theology. It was in the book of James, and it was talking about how to know God, and by knowing God, how to love Him. And I was trying to get into this theme of New Year's, of change, of resolution, and things like that. And it's actually funny. How many of you have ever seen the kids show Phineas and Ferb before? Okay, so I'm going to talk about Phineas and Ferb for a second. I was watching a show with my son the other day, and it was a New Year's Christmas type special, and it was actually a New Year's special. And Dr. Doofenshmirtz, and if you don't know, Dr. Doofenshmirtz is the bad guy, and he's always trying to take over the town of Dansville, right? And so he always hatches these elaborate plots, and he's always foiled by a platypus. So I can tell you how good he really is at being a bad guy. But anyway, he hatched this elaborate plot to where he was going to go to the Danville New Year's celebration, and when everyone was making their New Year's resolutions, he had a resolution changer-inator that would change their resolution to follow him instead and obey him. And so he is able to do this. He gets up. Everyone makes the resolution. He presses the button on his bow tie, which was the resolution changer-inator. And it changes everybody's resolution to listen to and obey and follow him as their leader and master. And so he's like, all right, let's go take over City Hall. And he marches out, and nobody follows him. And nobody follows him. He's like, what's going on? Why isn't anyone following me? And one of the guys in the audience, he actually says, well, nobody ever follows or listens to their resolutions anyway. So that was the big deal. Perry let him do this, let his plot pass through, because he knew that it wouldn't matter anyway, because nobody ever really follows their resolutions. So this year I thought, well, I'm not going to ask you to do anything. I'm not going to ask you to physically change anything. But in the theme of New Year's, and remember this is the last Sunday of 2013, and who else is just really surprised at how fast 2013 actually went? I mean, I cannot believe how fast it went. But yeah, next Sunday it'll be 2014. And so I thought, in the spirit of change, in the theme of change, I thought instead we would talk about maybe changing, if nothing else, our mindset and our way of looking at things. So thank you all for coming, and let's get into this. So we're going to be in the book of John, chapter 5, and we're going to be reading out of the ESV. And so John chapter 5, verses 1 through 18 says this. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed. He took up his bed and he walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. All right, so start back at verse 1. It says, "After this," and the NIV translates this "sometime later." And if you know anything about me, you know that, if I'm going to be talking about a topic, or we're going to be jumping into the middle of a book, or even the beginning of the book, we want to know context. We want to know what's going on. We want to define the terms, so we know what it is that we're talking about. So this "after this sometime later," what is this referring to? Well, it's referring to, obviously, what happened before this, right? Easy enough. So what happened before this is that Jesus had been in his ministry for a while. So he had called his disciples to him. He had performed the miracle in Cana of turning water into wine. He actually, during the Passover, had cleared the temple courts in Jerusalem. If you remember that story, he cleared the temple courts. He overthrew the tables. He fashioned a whip out of cords and was whipping people, trying to get them out of there. Right? He left Jerusalem and began a public teaching ministry. He teaches a Jewish leader the meaning of salvation. He has John the Baptist testify about who he was. He heals an official's son, and he evangelizes a Samaritan woman and the entire town. So this had all happened before now. And now he's returned to Jerusalem for some sort of festival. And we don't know exactly what festival it was. We just don't know. There's been commentators, there's been historians who've tried to pour through the book of John and the other books and try to figure out exactly which festival this was. And they're doing so because they're trying to create a chronology. They're trying to create a timeline of Jesus' ministry that fits into what Scripture says about him having a public teaching ministry of about 3 years. So in order to make this chronology, this timeline work, they say that this is actually the next Passover. So they're saying a year has passed since the last Passover and the last time he was there. But there's nothing actually in the text itself that gives us that information, and there's no reason for us to have to hold to that. We don't know. It's just a festival of some sort. There's some sort of festival, and Jesus has come back into Jerusalem at this point. If we go on to verses 2 and 3, we see as Jesus came into Jerusalem, he apparently passed through the sheep gate. Now, the sheep gate was a small entrance into Jerusalem that was in the northeast segment of the wall. It was actually very near to the temple. So we know the sheep gate is a real place. It still exists today, right? And we also know that archaeological evidence has confirmed the existence of this pool of Bethesda. And we know that it was also in the northeast section of Jerusalem, very near to the sheep gate. So, and from excavations, if you want to look at some pictures later, you can actually Google the pool of Bethesda, and they've excavated where they think it is. And it was apparently a divided pool that had a bridge in between it. And it actually, with the bridge itself, it had these 5 colonnades that they talk about in the book of John. So, according to the text here, apparently many sick people, the lame, the blind, the invalid, they would come to this pool and they'd gather here. And so these people probably would have naturally caught the attention of Jesus as he was passing by. And that's assuming that he didn't actually go there intentionally, which he probably did. Right? So, how many of you have looked closely at this section of Scripture? Do you notice something about it? Anyone notice anything unusual about this section right here? Is there a verse 4? No. It goes from verse 3 to verse 5, right? Why is that? why are we missing verse 4? Well, the reason why we're missing verse 4 is because in many of the earliest manuscripts that we have, the second part of verse 3 and all of verse 4 is missing. So the earliest manuscripts, anything prior to AD 400 that we found, does not have these verses in it, does not have this section in it. So the prevailing opinion is that this was an insertion by a later copyist. And this later copyist inserted this section that's missing in order to give us some information to clarify what was going on here. Because does it really make sense that a bunch of sick and lame and blind and invalid people would be gathering around the pool? I mean, and then later for this guy to say, when Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? He says, well, I can't get to the pool fast enough. So we don't really know why they needed to get to this pool. So this later copyist probably inserted this to explain what was going on here. And so I don't think it's necessarily inspired, but it gives us some background information on what was going on. So the missing text would read something like this. And they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool, after each such disturbance, would be cured of whatever disease they had. So, I don't believe that there was actually an angel who would come down and stir up the water and somehow imbue some magical healing property into the water. So while the theology may be inaccurate, I think the information does give us a better understanding of why this was happening. So apparently there was this myth, there was this belief that people sitting by the pool, if the waters moved, that meant the next person who got into the water after the water started moving would be healed. Right? So then, does that help us to understand then why these people were gathering around this pool and why they were staying there for extended periods of time? They were waiting for this water to stir up because they thought that, okay, as soon as the water starts moving, I'm going to go jump in there and I'm going to be healed. And this is the scene that Jesus came upon when he entered into Jerusalem this day. It's a pool of water surrounded by people who had lost all of their hope of healing and restoration. And they were looking for anything that gave them even the faintest chance of this healing and restoration. Even a mythology that, if they stopped to think about it, probably was disproven time and again. Okay, so let's look at what happened after this. We go back to verses 5 and 6. There's a man who's introduced here. We don't know his name. That's never given to us. But he's an invalid. He's in some sort of weakened or sick condition, and he's been that way for 38 years. And we don't know for sure, but the implication from reading this is that he's probably been hanging out at this pool of Bethesda for a long time, if not the entire 38 years. So day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, even decade after decade, he would come to this pool with the faintest of hopes that he could be restored, that he could be healed. But he knew that he couldn't do it on his own power because apparently this weakened condition meant that he could not walk fast, he couldn't move fast. So anytime the waters did stir up, somebody beat him to it. Then Jesus comes along, and Jesus knows that he's been in this condition. He knows that he's been sick, he's been an invalid for 38 years. He knows he's been hanging out by these supposed healing waters for a long time. And he comes up to him, and he asks him a question. He asks him a question. And the question is, do you want to be healed? So on the surface, that question to me, it kind of strikes me as a little weird, a little off. And we're going to circle back to that later. We're going to look at this question in more detail. But that's the question that Jesus asked this man. Do you want to be healed? And in verse 7, we get the man's response. And what's the man's response? Does he answer Jesus' question? Well, he answers him, but he doesn't actually respond to the question. He doesn't say if he wants to be healed or not. Instead, his answer indicates the focus of what is life. What has life become? His focus had shifted away from a biblical understanding of God. And so he doesn't stop to actually really think about what Jesus is asking him, but instead responds on his center of focus, which is the pool itself. Right? He responds and he says, I can't make it to the pool on my own. I'm not fast enough. Anytime the water stirs up, somebody else gets there first. Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? His response is, I can't get to the water. So apparently he developed this view of God, where God's grace, his love, his mercy, his compassion, and his healing could only be experienced through an impersonal, first come, first served basis. And he wasn't strong enough to get there first. He'd actually essentially become a legalist. He believed that God could only be approached through adequate human effort. And he was upset, and he had lost hope because he couldn't put forth that adequate human effort. So, moving on, we see how Jesus responds to his response. Here we see Jesus gives him not what he asked for, not what he thought he needed, but he gives him what he actually needed. Now let's do a little thought experiment here. Let's stop and think. What if Jesus, instead of actually healing him, had said instead, okay, well, you know what? Why don't I just sit down here and I'll wait with you for the next time the water moves. And the next time the water moves, I'll pick you up and I'll carry you and I'll put you in the water. Or what if he had said, well, you know what? I've got all these followers, all these disciples here who do what I tell them to. I'll just tell one of them here to hang out. And the next time the water moves, he'll help you to the water and he'll make sure you get there first. What do you think the man's response would have been? He probably would have been thrilled, wouldn't he? He probably would have been overjoyed. He would have said, oh, finally, after 38 years, I have somebody to help me. All I got to do is wait until the next time the water moves, and he's going to help me get into that water, and then I'll be healed. It probably would have been, for him, an answer to years of heartfelt prayer. But Jesus, thank goodness, doesn't limit himself to this man's imagination and preconception. He doesn't limit himself to what this man thinks he needs, but instead he gives the man what he actually needed, which is true healing and true restoration. He doesn't feed into his mythology. He doesn't feed into his preconceptions. He meets him where he's at. And he gives him exactly what he actually needed. He said, get up, take up your bed, and walk. And the man does so. He didn't need to go down to the water first. He didn't need to be the first one in. He didn't actually even need to be the first one who talked to Jesus. Jesus said, get up and walk. And this man is restored. He is able to do exactly what Jesus told him to. And then the drama starts. Then we get some drama. Going on to the second part of verse 9 and verse 10, we get the legalists. We get the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the rabbis. They enter into the picture. You know, from my perspective here in the 21st century, I can never understand why the religious leaders in Jesus' day respond the way they do. I just don't get it. I can't, in my mind, grasp why these guys, when this man has just been healed of being sick for 38 years, been sick, unable to move, unable to take care of himself for 38 years. And he's miraculously, completely restored and healed. And what's their response? Do they rejoice with him? Are they jumping up and down saying, we've witnessed a miracle. Thank goodness. Thank God you are healed. No, what are they doing? They're nitpicking. They're focusing on the fact that this guy is carrying his mat. And according to their understanding of Old Testament law, that is wrong. That is work. That's a violation of the Sabbath. They could have either expelled him from the entire Jewish community or had him put to death for carrying this mat. And that's what they choose to focus on. They ask him, it's the Sabbath. They tell him, it's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to take up your mat. Oh, man, I just don't get it. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And I don't understand this man's response either, the invalid's response. What's his response to this? What does he do? Well, in verse 11 through 13, we see what he does. He tries to defend himself from their attack by selling Jesus out. He plays the blame game. He blames the man who healed him. He says, it's not my fault. This guy told me, pick up my mat and take it. And I did. It kind of fits this pattern that we're seeing in this man of blame shifting. It's blame shifting. Remember earlier when Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? He shifts the blame and says, well, it's not my fault. It's because, I'm sick and every time the water moves, I can't get there by myself. And I don't have anyone to pick me up, so somebody else gets there first. It's a pattern of refusing responsibility for himself. He doesn't look for another cause for his condition. He doesn't look to investigate to see if maybe, just maybe, it's a sin problem or something in his own life that's causing this condition. But instead, he blames someone else. It's because I couldn't get to the pool fast enough. And now, well, I'm only carrying this because the guy who healed me told me to. Right? And the only reason why he didn't actually tell them Jesus' name is because he didn't know it. And how do we know that? Because once he figures out who he is, he runs right back and tells them. We'll look at that in a little bit. But in verse 14, we see what happens after he met with these Jewish leaders. So they probably had been interrogating him, been grilling him, saying, why are you carrying that? Why are you carrying that? Who did this to you? Who did this unlawful thing on the Sabbath and told you to do this unlawful thing on the Sabbath? Could have lasted minutes, could have lasted hours, we don't know. But after he went through this, Jesus then seeks him out again. Notice Jesus here embodies a principle that we know about God, that he doesn't leave us in our darkness and ignorance, but seeks us out to restore us. So imagine how this guy is feeling right now, this invalid, this healed man. He's probably still in this state of hopelessness that we'd seen him in earlier, right? Because he's just been rejected by these religious leaders. They attacked him and they persecuted him instead of rejoicing with him. And now Jesus comes along and he doesn't do this. He doesn't attack him. He doesn't persecute him. He rejoices with him. He says, see, you are well. See, you are well. He points out, he affirms his healing, and then he gives him direction and purpose for the future. And when we see this direction and purpose is to stop sinning. Sin no more, and nothing worse may happen to you. So this statement itself is kind of difficult to really completely understand. So is Jesus here telling the man that his previous sick condition was a consequence of his sin? I don't know. In John 9, a couple chapters after this, a similar healing occurs of a blind man. And in that, the disciples actually specifically asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said it wasn't a result of sin, it wasn't because of sin, it was because he was born this way so that I could work my power in him and display God's glory. So here it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that, and from what we know about this man, what we can understand about this man based on the narrative, it's entirely possible that it could have been a sin problem. It could have been his sin that was causing this condition that he was in. Or Jesus could just be speaking in a more general, future-oriented sense, saying, hey, you need to quit sinning and have a right relationship with God before something worse happens to you. And what's that something worse? Well, it's eternal separation from God in hell, right? So whether or not Jesus is specifically saying that his sin led to his illness isn't the issue. But what is important is for us to understand that Jesus here is telling him to quit sinning. He's telling him, you need a restoration of the soul like the restoration of the body that you just experienced. And so then, what is this man's response to Jesus' encouragement and affirmation here? Well, verse 15 and 16, we see that as soon as that's done, he runs right back to these religious leaders that were persecuting him, and he drops a name. He says, hey, this guy did it. It's Jesus. Jesus, it's his fault. It's his fault that I sinned. It's not my fault. It's his fault, Jesus.
Yeah.
This guy, I doubt he ever really fully understood the significance of what happened to him. I doubt he ever fully understood who it was who was speaking with him and who it was who healed it. All he does is he continues his blame shifting. That's been a pattern that we've seen throughout this narrative, and probably it's been throughout his life. Blame somebody else. Right? And then we understand, we learn why Jesus is starting to be persecuted by these religious leaders. And why this persecution that we see throughout all the Gospels, where it started. And it started here because these religious leaders were mad at him. Because he healed a man on the wrong day of the week. He healed a man on the wrong day of the week. It was the Sabbath. Healing must be work of some sort. He healed. He broke the rules. They chose to persecute him, and they eventually choose to kill him because he healed a man on the wrong day of the week. So Jesus' response in verses 17 and 18 to the persecution actually just made them even more angry than they were before, and more insistent on trying to put him to death. Because not only does he break their man-made rules, and by breaking their man-made rules, he's attacking their power and their authority, but he also claims God as his Father. And so if we look at the argument here, Jesus answered, my Father was working until now, and I am working. His argument is that the Father, God the Father, the creator of the universe, still works even on the Sabbath. And this is something that the rabbis had wrestled with for centuries, and they finally came to the conclusion that God actually did have to work on the Sabbath, because if he did not, then the universe would cease to exist. So, Jesus is throwing their argument back in their face and saying, just as God works and is working, so too am I working. And so now they're accusing him not only of healing on the wrong day of the week, but of blasphemy. They're saying, you're making yourself equal to God in an attempt to displace God. And from what we know about Jesus, not only from this passage, but from the entirety of Scripture, that was never his intent. He never tried to displace God. He never tried to make himself more important than God, or in a higher position than God. And he actually explains that later on in this chapter, but we're not going to go into that. So, verses 1 through 18, we see a man being healed and Jesus being persecuted because he healed him on the wrong day of the week. So as always, we have to ask ourselves a question. Okay, we have this information. Now what? What do we do with it? How do we apply this? What can we take away from this and apply in our own lives? And this is where I want to circle back to that question that we talked about in verse 6. And at first, I wanted to title this actual sermon, I wanted to title it, Do You Want to Be Healed? Because this question is so important, I think, to understanding what's going on here. I think waiting by the water, or sitting by the water, better communicates the message. I still want to focus on the question itself. It resonated with me, particularly in this man's context. And so let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So remember I said that the question seems kind of funny. It seems kind of off to me. This man, he's been sick for 38 years. He's been sick for 38 years, and Jesus knew it. So don't you think the more straightforward, the more obvious question that Jesus should have asked him would be, Do you want me to heal you? But Jesus doesn't ask that. He asks, do you want to be healed? And so let's look at this man's life. Let's try to picture what his life may have been like. So, he's been debilitatingly sick for 38 years. We don't know the exact nature of the illness, but we do know that it apparently affected his ability to move. Maybe some sort of paralysis, maybe some sort of muscular or neurological degeneration. But it probably involves some pain as well. And he's been going through it for 38 years now. So let's imagine what his life would have been like. Day after day of sickness, of pain, of discomfort, of a lack of wholeness and completeness, and with no real hope of healing and restoration. What must his thought life have been like after a month, 6 months, maybe a year, maybe 10 years, about 30 years after it started? What about 38 years of daily suffering? What do you think his thought life would have been like? Who knows how many doctors he went to? How many religious leaders he consulted? And how many cures he tried with absolutely no result? And who knows if he ever even cried out to God for healing, for restoration, for an end of the suffering and the torment that he was experiencing, as well as an end to the ridicule and persecution that he was experiencing from a society that equated his suffering with his sin. And this went on day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, for 38 years. And then finally, somebody asks him, do you want to be healed? And I think after 38 years of suffering, this is a valid question. Did this man actually still want to be healed? Did he still have hope? Did he have any hope after all this time? Did he have any hope in God, in God's healing and God's love for him? Did he still hold on to any hope, or had he slipped into abject hopelessness? Had he slipped into despair? So instead of wanting to be healed, had he instead shifted to the point where his suffering, his sickness, his waiting by the water actually defined who he was? So that's why I think Jesus asked the question this way, do you want to be healed? Because the man's response, I believe, shows us that he had lost true hope in God. He placed all of his hopes, if he had any left, on this one thing, this pool, this miracle cure, this supposed manifestation of God's power that was just completely arbitrary and completely impersonal. It was a long shot and he knew it. And I believe that his actions, his responses to Jesus, and his responses to the Jews, the religious leaders, reveal that he actually no longer had any hope. He had no longer any hope in a personal and loving God. And he replaced a biblical understanding of God with conception of him as impersonal. And he placed his hope in healing and a mechanistic first come, first serve superstition. So, Jesus' question to the man was completely valid because it exposed the hardening of the man's heart. And I believe that is also a perfectly valid question for us today. My question to all of you is this: do you want to be healed? Or have you begun to define your existence as sitting by the water? I know there are many people here today who are in the midst of suffering, whether it be physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. We have sickness, we have disability, but we also have broken marriages, and we have errant children, we have depression, and we have unfulfilled dreams. And this has gone on in many of us for days, or weeks, or months, or years, or even decades. So, do you still have hope in God? Do you still have hope in His personal love and compassion for you? Are you still praying fervently and eagerly anticipating His loving response to your prayers? Or have you placed your hope in lesser things? Or have you even gotten to the point where you define yourself by what you're suffering? So that's the question, and if the answer is no, then my next question is why not? Have the days, the weeks, the months, the years of waiting taken their toll? Have you waited so long that your desire is no longer there? If so, then how can we get back to the place where we can be confident of God's love and of His promised restoration? Because we don't want to be like this man, do we? Do we want to be like this invalid? This person who is healed in body, but was never restored in spirit? Well, in conclusion, I'd like to briefly look at how we can maybe get back to the point where we have hope in God again. So I have 4 points, just 4, and then we can be done, okay? So 4 points. First, we have to remember that God's perspective on time is not ours. We have to remember that God's perspective on time is not the same as ours. God is eternal. We are mortal. We're bound by time and our perception of it. 2 Peter 3:8 says, with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. It goes on to say that the Lord's not slow to fulfill His promise, but is instead practicing patience and withholding judgment. In other words, God's perspective on time is not the same as ours. And His perspective is eternal and good and perfect. So, if God is slow in answering your prayers, as you define slowness, this doesn't mean that He will not answer it when the time is right. And that's what we have to realize about God. We have to have faith in God and His will and His timing of events. If God has not answered yet, it may be because the time is not yet right. So first, God's perspective on time is not ours. Second, when waiting for restoration, for healing, for God to answer our prayers, our faith in God can be strengthened when we recognize what He is doing in our lives. James tells us in James chapter 1 that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Every good and perfect gift is from God. Things like life itself, existence. Things like breath, color, sensation, good friends, good food, even the ability to enjoy good things. These all come from God. So if you're having trouble trusting God in one area of your life, in the area of suffering, in the area of pain, look at all the other areas that God is so good in your life. Look at all the other good things that you have in your life, and remember that those are all gifts from God too, and God only gives us good and perfect things. And when you do so, when you begin to focus on the good things in your life, that gives you the ability to have faith in God's promise for the healing and the restoration that you're praying for now. Third, we need to understand, we need to begin to understand, we need to come to the understanding that true healing and restoration from God is not the same thing as deliverance from a specific suffering, sickness, or pain. Though Jesus here offered a man physical healing, this doesn't mean that His answer to your prayers will be the same. So if we look at the Apostle Paul, if we remember his example, after all of the suffering, all of the deprivation, all the beatings, and all of the things that he went through, he says that he prayed to God to remove a thorn in his flesh. We don't know what the thorn is, but he said he prays fervently to God for the removal of this thorn. And what was God's response to him? Did God take the thorn away? No, God's response to him in 2 Corinthians 12:9, God says, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." So perhaps God has already answered your prayers for healing and restoration by promising you the grace and the power and the patience and the wisdom necessary to endure the suffering. But you've missed out because you're looking for physical healing or something different. Don't mistake a lack of physical prosperity or health with God not having answered your prayers. So restoration and healing from God is not the same thing as deliverance from a specific suffering. And finally, fourth one, we need to remember that God does not limit himself to our understanding and our imagination. As we saw with this invalid, he doesn't limit himself to what we think we need. Instead, he gives us what we actually need. If Jesus had limited himself to what this man thought he needed, he never would have been healed. He just would have gotten wet. Thank God, he does not limit himself to our imagination, but instead he gives us exactly what we really need. Friends, it all comes down to your understanding of who and what God is. If you have faith that God is in control, and that he's all-powerful, and that he's loving and wise and personal and good, then you can trust his timing of events, and you can trust how he chooses to answer your prayers. As Paul says in Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So as we leave here today, my question to you again is, do you want to be healed? Or have you become content with waiting by the water? So I urge you, I pray that you let go of bitterness. You let go of your pride and your suffering. You let go of your expectation of how you think that God has to work in your life. And that you ask him for true healing, for true restoration that comes through a relationship with him and knowing him and living in submission to his will. And if you don't know him, if you're here today and you don't know him, then you must know that this promise that we just read about in Romans 8 doesn't apply to you. But you can also be assured and be confident in the fact that you can come to salvation through the atoning, sacrificial death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you'd like to know more about that, if you'd like to talk about that, if you'd like to talk to somebody or pray with somebody about the things that you're experiencing right now, please don't leave here today without coming to see me, without coming to see another leader, without coming to talk to someone about this. Let's pray. Father God, I thank you.